finance has operated worldwide, you will understand the dire need to question every aspect of this vast, all-encompassing system and its validity. So, in order to provide an understanding of economics as it presently affects us, it is necessary to give a brief history of the history of money. Contrary to popular belief, it is very new in the human race's history. Ostensibly, the rationale for money at all existed in ancient times to manage scarcity, in order to ensure that enough labour was contributed to a social system and that it was proportional to the natural resources that people then extracted out of that system they were in. Coined money appeared around 1500 BC, possibly earlier, and many credit the Lydians with introducing gold and silver coined money. This coined money system is termed commodity money, being formed or created out of a good or material that is perceived as valuable or has some tangible use. And while there are two materials we would commonly associate with this, being gold and silver, in fact many materials or objects have been used as a base commodity value, such as copper, another familiar one still used today, salt, peppercorns, which pretty much takes care of restaurants, doesn't it? Large stones, decorated belts, shells. The Far East used shells quite a lot. Alcohol, cigarettes, which makes me a millionaire, chocolate and candy generally, and barley, and my favourite one, weed. This one's particularly interesting. One can only surmise as to how much more peaceful and yet massively unproductive and pizza-consuming the world would be if there were a commodity currency of the globe made of weed. Yet one might also suspect that a downside to the cannabis-based monetary system would be hyper-deflation. The next step of monetary evolution was to representative or receipt money, a sort of meta-money, if you will. This representative money derived from promissory notes or receipts issued by goldsmiths to individuals who deposited their gold, which had become the dominant commodity money, for safekeeping in the goldsmith's safe when it became too much to carry or to ensure security of their stash. As trade between the populace picked up, or whenever someone came into a lot of wealth, carrying around large sacks of gold or any other precious metal became cumbersome and heavy. Depositing it in the goldsmith's safe is much safer. I wonder which of those words came first. Not only that, the goldsmith issued promissory notes to enable someone to easily pick up their gold when needed. These promissory notes from the goldsmiths were essentially receipts for the amount that they had been deposited, and thus were essentially still backed 100% by the known value, an equal value to the face value of that receipt, of course. This receipt here is actually English. It comes from 1774, although I must point out it does also specify interest, so that doesn't quite fit into the order I'm doing things, but it is a fairly good example. People began directly trading these receipts in the marketplace instead of going to their goldsmith, removing the gold from the vault, and then using that to buy goods. Essentially, it's a swap of IOUs, all backed by the goldsmith's stash, for any good or service that's required. Around this time, the promissory notes were adorned with the phrase that you'll be aware of if you've ever looked at the money that we actually use today, the promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of. Essentially, the bearer of the note was able to lay claim to the gold in the vault due to the ownership of the promissory note in his or her possession, so they were naturally transferable, very much like the original shells and belts and Snickers bars and all the other stuff that we used. The immediate effect of this was that very few people actually removed their gold from the vaults, and this is absolutely key in the history of finance. Trade was abstracted to the level of paper representations. The goldsmith, already earning a proportion of the gold stored via vault rental costs to store the gold in the first place, realized he now possessed a large amount of gold on a near permanent basis, which was just sitting there. On average, just 10% of the gold was ever removed or redeemed by the people bearing any notes at any time, meaning that the goldsmith could safely lend up to 90% of the excessive gold without running short, should any of the rightful owners return and demand their actual gold. The goldsmith began lending out at interest, doubling up his earnings, essentially profiting off the wealth of others who were already paying rental fees for the alleged safekeeping of this gold, despite the fact that the gold in the safe, already represented by and tied to receipt money, was not available for circulation. G. Edward Griffin, who wrote The Seminal Creature from Jekyll Island, explains this paradoxical scenario through a game of poker. Let's pretend that we all converge on Charlie's house for a poker game, and that upon arrival, each of us hands Charlie a $20 bill. Charlie, acting as a banker, issues each of us 20 poker chips and stuffs the money in an envelope. The agreement is that I may leave the game at any time and exchange each of the chips I possess for $1. Now comes Larry, Charlie's brother, But Larry isn't here to play poker. Larry's in a tight spot and needs to borrow some money. Since 8 of us are playing poker, there's a total of $160 in Charlie's envelope, and that turns out to be just exactly what Larry needs. You can well imagine what would happen if Charlie decided to lend out his idle money. It is not available for lending. Neither Charlie nor any of us other players has a right to loan that money out because it is still being held in escrow, so to speak, pending completion of a contract between Charlie and his guests. Those dollars really shouldn't have been even considered money at this point because the value that they represent has been assigned to the poker chips. If any of us has enough compassion for Larry's plight to want to loan him the money, it must come from other money in our possession, or we turn in our chips and repossess the money in the envelope in order to give Larry that. We could not spend or loan that money in the envelope and still consider the chips to be worth anything. That is the absolute key point to his story. Griffin succinctly sums up the issue. Chips, or any other representation, are valuable only as abstractions of another value held in escrow until exchanged. The use or reuse of that valued object undermines the value relationship as one does, for example, a one-sided seesaw. The tendency towards undermining this value representation by lending out more than was in reserve led to an unpleasant occurrence for the goldsmith. For when the goldsmith became fabulously and ostentatiously wealthy, thanks to the fact that he was now beginning to earn off the interest on someone else's money, those who had placed their gold in reserve were led to believe that perhaps he'd been lending out and spending their gold instead of storing it. Panicking, large numbers of account holders got together and demanded their gold all at once. Obviously, there was not enough to go around. One of two things could happen. The goldsmith could go out of business and, I would imagine, have his cranium forcibly removed, or he could cut them into the deal to prevent going broke and retain their business and, of course, their gold. This was a major shift in the practices of what came to be modern banking. Essentially, it was the shift from vault rental to what we understand to be interest today, as this monthly incremental earning mechanism became applied to both the vault owner as well as the depositor or the account holder. Where did the extra gold come from to pay that? Of course, it came from the people borrowing from the goldsmith. This, then, would become the basis for modern banking, lending out more than that was on hand, and this has led to a third type of money. So we've gone from commodity money through to receipt money, and now we're at fractional money. Essentially, a note backed by only a fraction of its value in reserves. And the process by which it is lent to the general public is called fractional reserve banking. Here's how it works, from the creation of bank reserves within a commercial bank through to the creation of loans to the general public. So, here's what we're going to walk through, and before I actually start, I should probably quote Alan Greenspan, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, who once said, "I guess I should warn you, if I turn out to be particularly clear, you've probably misunderstood what I've said." And he's right. Money, contrary to what I thought, is not produced by the government. Here's how it works in the UK. The Central Bank of the United Kingdom is the Bank of England, a privately owned company with exclusive rights to the money supply for the entire UK. Of course, you can write to the Bank of England and ask them if they are privately owned. Of course, they'll tell you they're not. But even cursory knowledge of history would completely inform you otherwise. It was chartered in 1694, owned by a group of individuals who were never revealed. It was then nationalised in 1946 in that the government bought all the stocks in it. Yet the government didn't have the money to buy it. So, brilliantly, the Bank of England was bought through the use of stocks that bore the burden of interest. In other words, the government borrowed the money to buy the bank from the bank. And it only gets weirder. Here's how money is actually created. Here we have, we'll map the creation of £10 billion. So, the Bank of England creates 10 million. The Bank of England creates 10 million out of thin air and credits its own account. Using this money, it then buys government bonds or corporate bonds from commercial banks or any lending institution. The sale results in the money being deposited in the reserve accounts of financial institutions across the UK, and hey presto, money has been created and distributed to lending institutions. Now, let's say that one of these commercial banks has received 10 million in deposits from the Bank of England. On the basis of this, they lend a couple 10 grand to buy a house. Wishful thinking perhaps, but nonetheless. Now, it would make sense to assume that the 10 grand lent to the couple came out of the bank's reserves, which already invented money, leaving £9,990,000, yet this is not the case. For As modern money mechanics puts it, of course the banks do not lend their depositors money. If they did, no new money would be created. What is